Mute people.
Yep.
All right, admitting all.
Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give folks just a couple of minutes to join the webinar. It's a short webinar, so we do want to get going relatively quickly, but recognize that if folks had a meeting just before, then it'll be a quick changeover. While we are waiting, I can actually bring this up, just a reminder that we have a COC webinar coming up in early June, along with a couple of Forest Stewardship Standard virtual workshops. We've held 2 in-person workshops, and now we're going to be holding 2 virtual workshops for folks who would like to attend. There'll be similar content, but one we're hoping to have more focused with participants, more of a Western focused, and one with participants with more of an Eastern focus. And then, of course, our annual conference, Stewardship in Action, will be in Seattle this October. The first day's a field tour, and then the next 2 days are meetings, including an optional labor session on Wednesday morning. And I think with that, are folks still arriving? Yeah. Maybe give it one more minute, Carly, or if things slowed down.
Maybe 30 more seconds.
Okay. Welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll get started here in just a second. Or maybe a couple seconds. All right, we're 3 past the hour. I'm gonna suggest we get going. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'm actually gonna go back to that intro slide. Like I said before, thank you very much for being here with us today. We're here to talk about the draft FSC US Forest Stewardship Standard Risk Assessment. So this is because in 2023, FSC introduced a new way to streamline forest management certification and audits. That was the introduction of the option for a country to have a risk assessment associated with their forest stewardship standard. These risk assessments provide a framework for certification bodies and auditors to implement risk-based auditing. It allows CBs to focus audits on the elements of a forest stewardship standard where FSC can have the greatest impact. In the US, Carly and I were really excited to be working on this because we think that it will provide, first of all, a framework for more formal risk-based auditing in the US. And almost as importantly, it'll give CBs and auditors an opportunity to reward long-term good actors in the system while maintaining system integrity. All right. So this time I'm going to skip through that quickly. Here's our agenda for today. I am Amy Clark Eagle, Director of Science and Certification for FSC US. And with me is Carly Evans, who is our forest management specialist. And Carly's going to be presenting a little bit later on, but all of this work would have been impossible without her. So I want to make sure she gets her accolades here today. We are recording this session, and we're going to make it available on our FSC US YouTube channel. That will include the question and answer session. We're going to ask that you please put questions in the chat. This really helps us to document everything and figure out, if there's things that we need to do differently another time or explain better in future communications and those kinds of things. We're going to stop very briefly after number 2 on this agenda, which is kind of what the things would change when auditing is done with FSS risk assessment. And we'll do quick questions there. And then the rest of it, we're going to run through and do another session of questions at the end. All right, Carly, if I missed anything in terms of the welcome.
I think we're good. Welcome, folks.
Okay, awesome. As per usual, just a quick reminder that as participants in this meeting, we need to be mindful of the constraints of antitrust laws. There shall be no discussions of agreements or concerted actions that may restrain competition. This prohibition includes the exchange of information concerning individual prices, rates, market practices, or any other competitive aspect of an individual company's operation. Each participant is obligated to speak up immediately for the purpose of preventing any discussion falling outside of these bounds. So please keep this in mind. Thank you. All right. So this year in 2026, 3 countries are taking advantage of the opportunity to do forest stewardship standard risk assessments. All 3 of us were given approval to complete these processes this year with an emphasis that they must be completed this year. There are some changes happening in terms of development of FSS and potentially how the risk assessments will be implemented moving forward with a revision of a series of procedures related to development of forest stewardship standards. And that's supposed to come in, the final version is supposed to be published later. So we have to finish before those are come into being. Why are we doing this? Basically, we think it's really important. During development of our revised forest stewardship standard, we've heard a lot of concern from certificate holders regarding the increasing rigor and of the standard and the potential impact that this could have on the value of maintaining FSC certification. So what we're hoping is that this will improve both the actual and perceived value proposition for FSC forest management certification through cost savings from streamlined auditing and by focusing audits on the elements of the standard where FSC can have the greatest impact. And that's most important. So we are working on some calibration with France and Finland. The results of these 3 processes will inform future revisions to the procedure that we're following for this, and also the procedures related to the development of forest stewardship standards. So before moving any further, I do want to do a little bit of level setting. And this is all from our perspective. So this is because of conversations we've had with other countries and with CBs and with others. This is kind of where we see the value and the benefits of having a forest stewardship standard risk assessment. So prior to having this in place, CBs had, or I'm sorry, previously in kind of FSC's history, CBs had a set of minimum numbers of audit days that were required, that was based on the size of the management unit. Those minimums were actually taking out of the normative framework a little bit ago, and so CBs have had more flexibility. And the normative language now says that it's up to them to decide what's the appropriate number of audit days for a particular certificate holder. So with that in mind, there is now the possibility that having the risk assessment and having this formal kind of structure for evaluating risk of nonconformance, this could allow a certification body to potentially justify a shorter audit. However, this obviously needs to be done considering the full context of the management unit and the certificate holder and other things that are going on. So could it reduce the duration of an audit? Possibly, yes. All right, so will it reduce the cost of an audit? Possibly. So there is some potential for reduced costs due to the reduction in maybe preparation time or duration of audits for CBs. That's a possibility. However, we think that the greatest opportunity for cost savings actually is more related to internal costs, that with the results of the being able to use the risk assessment to help streamline audits, there will be potentially fewer, or most likely fewer staff that might need to be involved in audits, less preparation for audits for certain elements in certain parts of the standard, potentially fewer people who need to be involved in the audit process, and those kinds of things. So we do think that there is potential for reduction of cost. It might be more related to internal costs than external costs, however. And then finally, will this result in streamlined audits? Yes, that we're really secure on. We truly believe that this risk assessment will help to focus audits on where they're going to most likely have the greatest impact, and therefore mean that audits are not spending time on elements where there's really no value to be gained. So just kind of wanted to put that out there at the beginning. And now kind of step through, how would this change audits in terms of what gets addressed during an audit? So first, to understand, the FSS risk assessment will have a risk designation for each indicator, okay? And this risk designation affects the frequency of audit for that indicator. If there's a specified risk designated for an indicator, that means that the indicator needs to be evaluated every year. There are some exceptions to this for family forests and a couple of other types of certificate holders, but generally, the indicator needs to be evaluated every year. If the indicator has a low risk designation, then the indicator needs to be evaluated once and then not again. As many 5-year certification cycles as you go through, doesn't matter. If it was in conformance the first time, it does not need to be evaluated again, unless there's some kind of evidence of non-conformance. Stakeholder observations or information, other evidence, or something the auditor observes or hears, something along those lines. If the indicator has an undesignated risk designation, then those indicators basically continue to be evaluated similarly to the way that they have been. They get evaluated during an initial audit when you first get certified, during recertification audits at the beginning of the next 5-year cycle, and at least one of the surveillance audits. Just going to highlight one thing really quickly. The term specified risk is being used in this kind of overall framework. It's different from how it's used. This term is used in controlled wood. Here, specified risk represents kind of a higher level of risk. In the controlled wood world, specified risk is, or has been, it's now non-negligible, but it has meant anything that was not low risk. So there is a little bit different in terms of the use of terminology here. Okay, so what does this look like? In a typical audit cycle, you have the very initial certification audit when you get your FSC certification for the certificate for the very first time. That's followed by 4 annual surveillance audits. And then at the end of that 5 years, you get recertified and a new 5-year cycle begins. So you'd have that recertification audit and then 4 more surveillance audits and on and on and on. So traditionally, under that initial certification audit, you would evaluate all indicators. And then during the surveillance audit, there's a set of kind of indicators, mandatory indicators that have to be evaluated during every surveillance audit. And then for all of the others, the CB or the auditor would select a number of them to audit each of the 4 surveillance audits, but they have to be audited at least once during that 4-year surveillance period. And then with the recertification audit, again, every indicator gets audited. Under the risk assessment, the initial certification audit is the same. All indicators must be evaluated. Then during the surveillance audits, for all 4 years, specified risk indicators get audited every year. And then a selection of the undesignated risk indicators gets audited each year. So over the 4-year period of time, those undesignated risk indicators need to be audited at least once in the 4-year period of time. You note the low risk are not included there, and nor are the low risk included in the recertification audit. So all of the specified risk and undesignated risk would have to be audited during the recertification audit, but not the low risk. You can look at this a slightly different way. If you kind of mentally put the indicators in 3 categories: higher risk, lower risk, middle, moderate risk. Currently, those higher risk indicators are determined by the CB evaluation standard 20007. It identifies the criteria with indicators that need to be evaluated every audit. All of the other indicators are lumped together, and they get evaluated at an initial certification audit, a recertification audit, and at least once during the surveillance audits. So now we have 3 different categories of risk using the FSS risk assessment. The higher risk indicators are no longer determined by what's in 20007, which is kind of a globally consistent for any country that doesn't have a risk assessment. Instead, the specified risk are specifically those that are higher risks here in the United States. And those are the indicators that get evaluated every audit. The undesignated risk, similar to before, initial audit, recertification audit, and at least once during the surveillance audits. Low risk indicators only at the initial certification audit. And after that, only if evidence indicates that there's a need. So the big things here are, for the first time, the higher risk, the indicators that get audited every year, are determined not in a generic global way, but are specific to what's highest risk here in the US. And secondly, for the first time, some indicators will only have to be audited once and then never again unless there's some evidence that there's a need. There is another big change. And that's that with this risk assessment in place, certification bodies, after the first 5 years of FSC certification bodies can actually adapt individual indicator risk designations to reflect the performance and context of an individual certificate holder. So CBs have always had some flexibility for increasing the effective risk level for an organization and auditing more frequently as a result. But only now will they have the ability to, in fact, decrease the effective risk level for an individual certificate holder and therefore audit less frequently than they might have otherwise. So for that first 5 years of certification, you use the risk designations that are in the FSS risk assessment. And then after that, CBs can adopt individual indicator risk designations. They have to consider a set of factors that may affect risk at an organizational level that will be included in the risk assessment, but they can also use additional sources of evidence. So CBs will be able to recognize how audit history, local legislation, intensity of management, and other factors that affect risk might need to be considered and adapted for a particular certificate holder. All right. Oh, and what I didn't say was, yes, CBs have the ability to go up or down, and that includes if something is low risk in the FSS risk assessment, they could change it to specified risk. or undesignated. And this opposite is true. They can go from specified to low if there's adequate evidence and justification for doing that. All right, so with that, I'm running a couple minutes behind, but Carly, if there have been any questions, we
Um,
could hit this.
we've just had one question come in, which is how do we see this working if a different CB is contracted from one 5-year cycle to the next? Specifically, the when it comes to these factors.
Yeah, so if you're talking about the national level, risk designations will not change if you change from one CB to another. If you move to a new CB, my understanding is that they would need to evaluate the evidence and the information available about you, and then use that if they're going to do any adaptation. If it's a new CB, they may decide, that they want to have some history with you before they begin to do that. So that's something that will be maybe different from one CB to another. The adaptation of risk designations is voluntary for CBs, but every CB that I've talked to has indicated that this is something that they are planning to do. I have not talked to all of them, but just small sample, it seems to be something that they're planning on doing.
Thanks. We have two more questions about the same topic, which is about this after 5 years of certification. Does
Mhm.
that clock start with the new standard? Is it 5 years if you've already been certified for 5 years up until now, are you eligible for this? Or is it 5 years once the risk assessment goes into place?
No, my understanding that this is the intent here is that you are developing a history of performance. And so for the first 5 years that you're certified under whatever standard it is, then that's what gets considered is you're developing a performance history. Now, a CB may not change something from the FSS risk assessment if you're moving to a new standard and the indicators in the new standard aren't directly aligned with what you've been audited to previously, and that might be part of their consideration. But my understanding is that this is about you've had a certificate for 5 years, then the CBs are able to begin doing this.
Thank you. I think that's all for now, and we can move on.
Okay. All right. So just going to walk a little bit through the process and the methodology that we've been going through to develop the draft, which is out for consultation right now. And then Carly's going to talk a bit about summary results of the risk designations that have been proposed. So the process that we're following is defined by procedure 60010. If you want to go and find the technical language, I pulled some of the key elements out of that. The process says you need to confirm what's the scope of the risk assessment. So which indicators will be included in the risk assessment? The US board said every indicator will have a risk designation. Which types of risk will be considered? It could be just specified or just low. The board decided that the scope will be all types of risk designations. And then the final bit about scope is what's the scale? And we're going with risk designations in the FSS risk assessment that are national in scope. So the same across the country. And I'll clarify, this is the conterminous United States. As with the forest stewardship standard at this time, the scope of the risk assessment does not include Hawaii, Alaska, or any of the territories. Okay, the second element covered by this procedure is that risk needs to be considered within the scope of what is the risk of nonconformance for a particular indicator. And then secondly, what would be kind of how severe is the level of impact if a nonconformance were to occur? And that these are the two things that need to be considered when looking at what should a risk designation be for an indicator. And then the procedure also defines kind of what's the process for decision making. The working group, technical working group, is required to have consensus decisions on risk designations. The US board will look at the process that's been followed and then confirm whether or not the procedure was in fact, or the process was aligned with the procedure requirements. And then the risk assessment gets submitted to FSC International for the final review and approval process. In terms of looking at this stepwise, we officially did a lot of the work back in 2023, even starting before the procedure 60010 was finalized. This was done with the approval of FSC International, actually with funding from them. So we formed a technical working group at that time, and the consultant supported the process. And the working group was working using draft 3 of the revised forest stewardship standard that was the most recent available at that time. So the bulk of the work was done in 2023. This year, when we got the formal approval to continue the process and complete it, the first step was to update those risk assessments and to look at what had changed between draft 3 and the final approved version of the standard, and determine whether or not that, would affect the appropriate risk designation in the opinion of the technical working group. So that was the work early this year. Right now we have the public consultation. After that, the working group will evaluate comments and adapt risk designations and the factors affecting risk at an organizational level as needed. And then we go through all of the approval and review and approval processes. So the technical working group, who's at the table? We have 3 standard development group members. So the standard development group was responsible for the revision of the forest stewardship standard. We have 2 SDG members from the environmental chamber and 1 from the economic chamber. We also have 2 individuals participating with audit experience, 1 working directly for CB, 1 being a contract auditor. We have 4 forest management certificate holders, 1 representing a large industry, 1 representing a public agency, 1 representing a forest management group, and 1 representing a tribal certificate holder. We also now have a individual representing the social chamber. So the technical working group is mostly consistent from the one that was working in 2023 to 2026. We did have 1 standard development group member replaced, and then 1 of our certificate holder representatives was placed along with the addition of the social chamber representative. It's really, really important to recognize that the technical working group is required to use objective, verifiable, and reliable evidence for their decisions on risk designations. Professional opinion of the working group members in terms of what they think is a high risk or low risk, a nonconformance or potential impact, that's not eligible input into this process. The working group has to be able to point to external sources of information that meet these 3 criteria and use that information for making decisions. And then again, as I mentioned before, decisions need to be consensus decisions. And just to kind of put it out there, this also goes for the consultation. We're looking for comments about how the technical working group interpreted the evidence that was available to them, and or provision of new sources of evidence that were not previously considered. Okay, so I'm going to walk, this gets a bit messy, but I'm going to walk through kind of the basic stepwise process that was taken to come to the proposed risk designations that are in the draft. We're really lucky in the United States. We have a massive data set that has a record of the nonconformances that were assessed to certificate holders under the version 1 standard. So from 2010 to 2022, we're estimating there were probably somewhere in excess of around 1,200 audits. Recognizing that not every indicator gets audited every year in most situations, we're guessing that most indicators, you could say, had a minimum of 500 audits at which they were assessed under the version 1 standard. This is important, and it's also important that there are a lot of indicators in the version 1 standard that are very similar to what ended up in the version 2 standard. So we have this really good evidence of the history of nonconformances in the United States for a large number of the indicators in the new revised version 2 standard. It's really interesting that based on this data set of nonconformance, almost 60% of the indicators have, under version 1, have an estimated frequency of nonconformance of 1% or less. So that means out of 100 audits, the likelihood of nonconformance for 60% of the indicators is that only one or less of those audits will actually produce a nonconformance. We've been unable to determine, most countries don't have this kind of data set. We paid people to go through all the large history of audit reports in order to develop this data set. Most countries don't have this. So we haven't been able to determine if this really, really low rate of nonconformances is something that's consistent globally, or if it's unique to the US. This could affect what happens with risk and considerations around risk moving forward if we find out that this is more unique. All right. So given the fact that so many of the indicators had a very low rate of nonconformance, it was difficult for the technical working group to establish thresholds. So in the end, they did look at that distribution of indicators with more and fewer nonconformances, and they really focused on the two ends of that distribution. So the indicators with very, very low rates of nonconformance and the indicators with very, very high rates of nonconformance. This is a more conservative approach than maybe could have been taken, but the working group may also reconsider this based on the consultation comments and the calibration that's ongoing with other countries. But generally what happened was that this assessment of history of nonconformances under version 1, if there were 29 or more nonconformances in the data set for a particular indicator, the initial risk designation was established at specified risk. If there were 2 or fewer nonconformances in the data set for a particular indicator, the initial risk designation was set at low risk, and then everything else in the middle, or if this was a new or significantly changed indicator in the version 2 standard, so there's really no evidence of no history and no evidence to be used from that data set, all of those plus everything in the middle went into the undesignated risk category initially. So then the working group considered other sources of evidence. This could include external data sets, information, the Controlled Wood National Risk Assessment. They also considered things like all of the consultation reports from the FSS development process and looking at what were the topics and the elements about which the greatest kind of concern from stakeholders was indicated as that is used as a representation of potential impact from if a nonconformance were to occur. So stakeholder concern is identified as a way of determining potential impact if a nonconformance were to occur. And they brought all of these into their consideration. And as a result, a lot of the specified risk remained specified risk. Some of them became undesignated risk. Similarly, a lot of the low risk remained low risk, but some became undesignated risk. I don't believe that as a result of this, we had any indicators that went from low to specified or specified to low. Okay, so then we also obviously had some undesignated risks that changed categories as well, although most of them remained in the same category. Okay, the final piece of this is that requirement that the technical working group have consensus on risk designations. And as a result of this, we did actually end up with a small number of low risk and specified risk indicators where at the end of it, the technical working group did not have consensus on whether or not the evidence available to them was, adequate to demonstrate that specified or high level of risk or low level of risk. So as a result, a very small number of indicators then defaulted to undesignated risk. Okay, and then I'm going to mute myself and turn over to Carly.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so we're just going to do a quick summary of the results of the working group's decisions that are available to look at in more detail in the consultation. And we're just going to go through them pretty quickly, not too much detail here, just want to give you a big picture of what's being proposed. And you can see more details and all the rationale for the decisions in the consultation platform, which Amy will talk about how to access after this. You can go to the next slide, Amy. So just an overall summary, you'll see that a majority of the indicators are proposed as undesignated, 77%. The smallest percent is our specified risk, and that's 20 indicators total. And finally, 13% low risk, which is 26 indicators. But we'll go through principle by principle now. This is just the overall picture. So, and also an important note about these summaries is that this is just about the base indicator. So there are several instances where a family forest indicator or for tribal management units, the risk designation might be different than for the base indicator. So just important to keep that in mind here. But for these environmentally leaning principles, there's generally a majority undesignated risk. Also, I apologize for the green on green. We were debating the design before this. I hope you guys can see these pie charts okay. But so for principle 6, environmental values and impacts, very few specified and very few low, mostly undesignated. But then in principle 9, high conservation values, we have no specified. And in principle 10, again, mostly undesignated with some specified and some low. Next slide. So for the socially leaning principles, there's a little bit more even distribution. For P2, workers' rights, only half is undesignated, and then the rest is split between low and specified. We have 33% low. For Indigenous peoples' rights, there actually were no low risk indicators in this principle, almost 30% specified. But in P4, community rights, principle 4, there are no specified and quite a few low, 33% low. So some balance there. For the remaining principles, we have a variety. You'll see, as makes sense in the US context, a majority of principle 1, which is compliance with laws, are low risk, and there's no specified in that principle. For principle 5, we have fairly even distribution. For principle 7, we have a majority undesignated with just some specified. And Principle 8 is interesting. It may seem like lots of specified, but in reality, Principle 8 only has 11 indicators. So four of those are specified. It seems like a high percentage when it's broken down at this principle level, but it's actually not that many indicators. And most of those, they're high because of those previous nonconformance rates that were aligned with previous indicators. Um, And it's also, and then also just remember, some of these are different for different management unit types. So for family forests, some of these may be low risk. Okay. And for the factors at an organizational level, so these are, as Amy said earlier, there's um, the factors that a certification body needs to consider when thinking about adapting the risk designations for a specific certificate holder. So these are the proposed minimum factors. There's 10 of them, and they really fall into three categories. One is the scope and scale, so that includes the intensity of operations, the size of a group, if it's a group certificate, the stability or changes to scope, so such as adding group members or new management units to a certificate. And then importantly, as we've had some comments about, the history of conformance is a big piece here. And that also includes things like the establishment of your management procedures, and how engaged stakeholders have been historically or are currently engaged in your management planning. And then finally, the geographic scope. So what jurisdiction are you in? What laws might apply there? And also what's happening on the ground. So, how many easements there might be.
And of course, it would help if I kind of was ready to unmute myself. Thanks, Carly. Appreciate it. All right. So then just a couple of quick highlights in terms of using the consultation platform, the FSC consultation platform. To participate, you're first going to have to log in if you've previously used the consultation platform or register. You are not allowed to participate anonymously, so you do have to register. And just as a note, make sure that you go to the US risk assessment consultation, which is the one here on the right, and not the one for Finland. So I'm guessing as you get in there, it's possible the language would be difficult to understand, but just a quick note there. Okay. The consultation ends on June 1 at the 1 second before midnight in Europe, in Germany. So this means that it ends just before 3 p.m. Pacific and just before 6 p.m. Eastern in the US. So you don't have until midnight on the 1st of June. You need to get your comments in earlier. On the very first page of the US consultation, you have a set of documents that you can download. The first one provides an overview similar to what we gave you here today about the process and the methodology. The second document is an overview of kind of what would change in an audit versus how previously audits have been handled. And then the third one is an Excel file with the proposed risk designations and the factors that might affect risk at an organizational level. It includes lists of the additional evidence that was considered for each of the indicators, and it provides a summary related to that history of nonconformances and also what was the technical working group's thought process for each indicator. If you want a quick look at the consultation questions, they're included in the overview document. Okay, and these are available from every page. All right. Next, that didn't change. Let's see. All right, here we go. There's a navigation at the bottom of every page. So here on the first background information page, if you click the arrows on the right-hand side, then it pops down and you can go to any page you want. If you only want to participate in part of the consultation and not in the whole thing, you can jump around. And you can see there's a set of 3 green buttons on the right-hand side. Next section obviously takes you to the next topic, but then there's a save current progress and a save current progress and exit. You can come and go at any time as long as you save. You can come back even if you've already hit the submit button at the end of the consultation. Just a note, the save current progress is your friend, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. In the pages that are focused on individual principles, there's one page for each principle. And on the left-hand side, there will be a list of indicators, which indicators were identified as low risk, specified risk, or proposed, I should say, as low risk, specified risk, or undesignated risk. The questions on the right-hand side typically have a radio button first, a yes, no question, and then an open text box where you can put in as many comments as you want. But please remember again that the questions really are focused on the evidence. And do you agree that the evidence is adequate for the risk level that's been identified? Do you agree that the working group has interpreted accurately? Are there additional sources of evidence that you think the working group needs to consider? And those kinds of things. So please, this is based on the evidence. Things to keep in mind are that all formatting gets stripped. When you enter comments, line breaks go away, italics go away, bold text go away, so does underline. You can use all caps if you want to emphasize something. We highly encourage you to make separations between different comments really, really obvious. Use slashes, do something else to really clearly separate out your comments. Also want to make sure you know that I've had a lot of experiences in the past where I'd be working really hard on my comments in one of these boxes, and then I would hit the button for the next page and discover that I'd been booted out of the system without it letting me know, and I lost all of those comments. So we highly recommend that you hit save frequently, or that you form your comments in an external document and then copy and paste them into here. Or potentially if you've been working on something for a while and you don't want to lose it, highlight and copy that text, and then so you have it in your computer's memory just in case it disappears. But be very, very careful to make sure that you don't lose things along the way that you've worked on really hard. There is a box at the end for any kind of additional comments that weren't covered by the questions in the previous pages. All of these boxes, if you grab the bottom right-hand corner, you can drag it and expand the box. Again, you can come back, make more comments when you hit submit. Every time you hit submit, the system generates an email to you, which includes all of your comments in it. I think that's pretty much it. You'll get this piece when you receive the slide deck. It has the link. It has a reminder of the time when the consultation closes and some of those other elements that I've covered. So just as a final closing message, what we're trying to achieve with this public consultation, number one, is to confirm the technical working group's interpretation of the evidence that was available to them. Number two, to identify any additional sources of evidence that the technical working group should be considering. And number three, to request feedback on the proposed organizational level risk factors that Carly talked about, that minimum set of considerations that a CB needs to think about as they're looking at potentially adapting risk designations for a specific certificate holder. They can go beyond that. They can use additional sources of evidence. They're not limited to these, but this is a minimal set of things that they need to consider. All right, so with that, questions? Carly, have we got any?
We haven't. There was one that I was able to answer in the chat.
Awesome.
Sarah, if you needed to say something, we're happy. You're welcome to come off mute, but sounds like maybe I answered your question.
All right, well,
I
we'll give
I can
people.
ask a question.
Oh, awesome.
Carly didn't answer my question, but this is Sarah Crow. I'm wondering, I guess, kind of two things. One, obviously, this is an effort that FSCUS has been engaged in. For commenters, are there areas that either areas of concern or areas that you would particularly want commenters to be attuned to, because they are areas where either you have concerns, or you're not really, or you just feel like it would be really good to get insight around this particular thing?
Um, I would say that the places where probably we could use the most attention would be the indicators where there was not a history of nonconformance. So where it's a new indicator or it has changed significantly, and so that data set of nonconformances was not applicable. And the working group was instead looking at other sources of information, maybe the controlled wood national risk assessment, maybe other things. So I think those would be the places where it would be most useful and helpful if you really want to focus in on something to, identify, are there other sources of evidence other than the ones listed that should have been considered? Or do you think that the working group possibly misinterpreted the evidence that was there and should have come to a different conclusion? I think those would be the most helpful.
Okay, thanks for that. And then the other pieces, and again, I haven't looked at this in detail just yet, but there's the risk designation piece, but I think there's also like and you talked a little bit about process, like evidence to be considered, but I think the last kind of question I have is there also an opportunity or a place to comment on like how this will work? So for example, the thing we talked about building an evidence file to support risk designation, or choices of emphasis by CBs. Like, is all of that up for grabs too?
If you have comments like that you would really like, that would be more to FSCUS as opposed to the rest of the questions are more for the focus of the technical working group as they move through this process. But if you do have some comments like that, please include them in that final kind of catch-all box. And Carly and I will definitely take them in and look at them and think about how we could help address concerns or take suggestions in terms of moving all of this forward into implementation next year.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Hey, Carly, anything else come up? It looks like you've been busy answering questions. Awesome.
Yeah, there's no more questions at this time.
Yeah, it's worth probably noting, I see there was something about health and safety. Of all of the indicators in the version 1 standard, the indicator that had by far and away the highest number of nonconformances was related to worker health and safety. So that was interesting. I think that based on some conversation, it was potentially linked to observations by CBs when they were on site, often related to use of the appropriate equipment, PPEs and whatnot. But it was by far and away the very highest rate of nonconformance for anything else in the version 1 standard. Okay. Well, then if there are no further questions, we really appreciate the comments. Thank you very much. Please do participate in the consultation. Really useful and helpful to get your feedback, whether positive or negative, and to help make this risk assessment the highest quality possible, so that we are able to continue to maintain a high level of integrity for the FSC system in the US, as we're implementing this FSS risk assessment. So thank you very, very much for being here, and enjoy your 5 minutes of found time. All right. All righty. The recording has ended. Thank you all. We're gonna shut this down.